Peter, this book is coming out at a very important time because I think consumers are getting really upset that these businesses don't have products. And it's like, you get tired of telling them, well, it's the supply chain. And they're going, I don't think it is. But this book right here really does kind of paint that picture of how this even came into being.
Yeah, look, it is the supply chain, and people have a right to be upset because we're dependent on this supply chain that's been optimized for big box retailers and investors that generally works pretty well. I mean, it's kind of a modern miracle, but it has engineered scarcity built into it. So every time there's some kind of disruption, we discover that there's not enough competition. There are a lot of monopoly powerful companies throughout the supply chain, and the cost of transportation goes up. That gets passed on to consumers. Costs of key goods like beef, it's a story I tell in the book, that goes up. You don't need a PhD in economics to go to the grocery store and discover that something's really out of whack.
Don't these businesses understand, though, that once a product is not there, it only invites me to go try the competition?
Well, they understand that good luck finding the competition in some businesses. I mean, take meat. In most of the country, there's one major supplier of meat. Yeah. There are 4 companies that control 85% of the meat packing and distribution capacity in the United States. That's a number that would make the robber barons blush. So, yeah, you can be upset about the fact that, you're paying record prices for beef. And by the way, you might be hearing this at a time when ranchers are going out of business because they're getting squeezed at the other end. And most of the gains are going to a handful of people, including the 2 convicted felons in Brazil who controlled JBS Foods, the largest meat packer in the U.S. But good luck finding an alternative.
And there's no way to break this up to make it 8 or even 12 different groups?
Yeah, there is. I mean, it's called antitrust enforcement. It's something that we used to have before Reagan. And then we've had presidential administrations on both sides of the political aisle, the Clinton administration, Obama, both Bush administrations, who were really marinated in this idea that scale was our friend and every merger was fine as long as consumer prices didn't go up immediately. And the result of that is we've got monopoly power throughout this economy. And time and again, we discover that prices for goods are going up far in excess of whatever companies have to, raise them by to recoup their own extra costs. And by the way, we're living through this right now. I mean, the Houthis in Yemen are opening fire on ships that are headed toward the Suez Canal. Yeah. This is a vital artery in Egypt that's a major pathway for goods going from factory towns in Asia to Europe and onto the east coast of the U.S. And as a result of that, ships are going the long way around Africa, which adds cost, it adds time. But we've seen shipping prices go up by 400% in the last few months. That's far in excess, analysts tell me, of what's actually required to recoup the cost. But we don't even know what the costs are because these industries are not transparent and they're laced with monopoly power.
Yeah, I was shocked when I read that about the ships because I had no clue that was even going on. I knew of the shortage and the stoppage and stuff like that, but I didn't know that the costs were going to go through the roof. Does the average consumer understands that when the shipping costs are going up, the truckers are going to charge more money, the grocery stores are going to charge more money?
I mean, whether we understand it or not is sort of immaterial. I mean, I don't put a lot of stock into consumers figuring out how to rescue us from global supply chain problems. I mean, we can look to spend our money in our local community. That's a good thing. We can look to buy local and from smaller businesses when we can. That's to the good. But let's face it, we're busy with our families. We're dealing with our kids. We're trying to get to our jobs. We're just trying to put gas in the car. We don't have time to figure out how OPEC works. We need government to do its job of imposing sensible regulations. We should actually cheer on the idea that in some industries, labor is figuring out how to secure greater wages for itself. I mean, I tell the story of Henry Ford in the book. He's a problematic character, but he knew a thing or two about supply chains. And he doubled the wages for his workers back in 1914. And a lot of people called him a communist. He said, look, I'm a capitalist. I'm just trying to make products reliably. And I understand that any business that's built on dependence on low wage workers is inherently unreliable. So, that's something that we could cheer on as a source of hope here.
The book we're talking about is how the world ran out of everything inside the global supply chain. I'm terrified that if something bad were to take place anywhere in this nation, that supply chain isn't going to live up to the expectation because it's hurting right now.
I mean, look, my wife can't get asthma medication as we speak.
Wow.
We had a newborn born in the first wave of the pandemic in 2020. We had it better than most. We had outdoor space. We could both work from home, but we suddenly couldn't get diapers.
Yep.
We couldn't get hand sanitizer. We couldn't even get the ingredients to make hand sanitizer. I mean, the supply chain is one of those things that most of us don't think about, 99.9% of the time, and for good reason, because it just works. We don't think about electricity when we flip on the light switch. We just expect it to happen. But when it doesn't happen, that is a cosmically bewildering experience. And when it happened in the middle of the pandemic, where we were frightened, we're stuck in lockdown, we're worried about our jobs and our businesses, it was, that should wake us up to the fact that we're dependent upon a series of systems that are not built with social interests, the public good involved. They rest on these profit-making companies. There's nothing wrong with profit-making companies, and there's nothing wrong with giant companies, but we need some say at the basic regulatory level over how they operate, and we need to demand that there's more resilience built in these supply chains in the same way that we depend upon electrical companies, and they're regulated as utilities. They make money, they return cash to their investors, and that's all to the good. And ideally, they innovate. But we know that they're crucial, and so the government's involved in making sure that this is regulated.
Shareholders versus blue collar workers. I mean, I understand that because I am a shareholder, but I'm also a blue collar worker. I'm for the little guy. I mean, there's got to be a better ladder here.
Yeah, I mean, if there's one thing that doing this book really brought home for me, it's this sense of normalcy. Everyone's talking about when will the supply chain get back to normal. Let's remember that normal, for those of us who've experienced the last half century of American life, is premised on the idea that there are large numbers of people who are desperate enough for work that they will give up any control over their schedules. They will be on the road for weeks, sometimes months at a time. I mean, I rode along with a truck driver from Kansas City down to Dallas and back in the middle of winter and saw, up close what a tough job that is. It's always been a tough job, but back before deregulation, it was a pretty well-paying job. Mm-hmm. And now it's a tough job that's not well-paying. You look at the situation for people working in warehouses, Amazon workers who were told there's no PPE for you in the middle of the pandemic, even though they're somehow able to put PPE into boxes for people who can pay for it. We are depending on a normalcy that requires exploitation to a level where, it's not just a humanitarian problem. If you want a reliable supply chain, it can't be built on the backs of people who will give up their jobs the minute there's an alternative because their jobs are so miserable.
You talk about Amazon. Inside my uneducated mind, I picture that they've got so much stuff inside their warehouses that the rest of them or the rest of the other businesses can't keep up. Is that possible? I mean, has Amazon changed the game that much?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was riding with a dray operator. That's a short haul truck driver who moves containers from, in this case, the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. That's the gateway for 40% of imports reaching the United States by container to a bunch of warehouses in the Inland Empire, mostly Riverside County. And we were at this port one day, and somebody said, "Oh, there's a problem with the chassis, the thing behind the truck on which the container sits." And he said, "Yeah. Oh man, we're going to get stuck here. I got to get inspected. If I need a new chassis, it's going to take hours and hours." No. And I said, "But look at all those chassis over there. There's like hundreds of them." And he said, "Oh, no, that's the Amazon pool. Amazon's got their own dedicated pool of chassis. They've chartered their own container ships. There's no question this thing has been built by the giant companies for their benefit."
Wow. The very fact that you were out there on the road doing this book, I mean, that just blows me away, and it makes me want to go back in there and reread a bunch of the paragraphs, because now that I know that you physically experienced this.
Oh, I mean, look, I'm a field reporter at heart. I mean, this book took me to Guatemala.
Wow.
I went with Columbia Sportswear to go look at factories that are closer to the North American market. It taps reporting I did when I was based in China for 6 years, right after China got into the WTO. I spent some time in Vietnam. I just came back from a couple of weeks in India, looking at how Walmart is moving production from China as companies try to limit their reliance on Chinese production, moving some sourcing over to India. Yeah, I like to get out and about. I mean, I hung out with traveling rail crew maintenance workers in Texas and other parts of the country to hear up close how, they are squeezed to do more and more work with fewer and fewer people to do it, such that, one guy quit. He was so horrified that they told him, we can't allow you to be home for your infant to have heart surgery. We are so squeezed for people that we need you there. That is a screaming sign that we've built a supply chain that's simply unreliable if we're demanding that of the people required to keep the trains moving.
Wow. Hypothetically speaking, if something were to happen to Taiwan, how would that change the supply chain around the world?
Dramatically.
I thought so.
Taiwan is the overwhelming, it's the largest supplier of hugely important computer chips that are the brains of the modern economy. I mean, if there is a conflict, if, let's say, the Chinese military moves in to take Taiwan, let's say the U.S. gets drawn in or the U.S. doesn't get drawn in, that disruption could be calamitous for businesses around the globe. And let's face it, there are people making products in places like the United States. Factory people. We like to talk as if there's no manufacturing left in the United States. There's millions of workers who are drawing their paychecks from factories and associated businesses that are serving factories. And if suddenly we can't get computer chips because of a conflict on the other side of the Pacific Ocean, a lot of people are going to lose their jobs. A lot of businesses are going to be in trouble.
Speaking of those chip makers, I went into shock when I read that the world of medicine needed those chips, but they were giving it to people like Apple and Google.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for picking up on that. Yeah, I tell the story of this company in San Diego called ResMed. And I talked to a guy who's a waiter in Southern California who has sleep apnea. He needs this medical device to ensure that he gets to take his next breath when he goes to sleep. And in the middle of the pandemic, there's this terrible computer chip shortage because businesses so badly miscalculated. They assumed that we were going to have this classic downturn as people are quarantined, as people are losing their jobs, and that'll result in less demand for all sorts of things. So they slashed their orders. Well, it turns out, okay, we're not going to work, but now our bedroom is an office. We need bedrooms. We need office equipment in there. Our kids aren't going to school. Now they need iPads so they can do their distance learning. We're not going to restaurants, but we're suddenly cooking 27 meals a day for kids. And that requires, new appliances. So a lot of this stuff's made in China. And we swamp the capacity of the shipping industry, of the warehouses, of the truck drivers to handle all this stuff. We get all of these shortages. And then as we try to turn on the capacity that we turned off for things like chips, guess who's first in line? The Apple with its iPhones, Google with its smartphones. Car companies thought they were really important. They can't get the chips they need. And so this little supplier of medical devices can't get their chips. And this waiter in Southern California is waiting for 6 months to get this device he needs to protect his life.
Wow. So I'm gonna kind of dig in deep here with something that I personally experienced here over the past, let's say 3 to 5 years. The one thing that has happened is that there's been huge promotions from the almond farmers. They want to be interviewed. They want to get their products. Is it because they couldn't get into China and into other countries?
Well, the story of the almond farmers is the story of how we're at the mercy of this international shipping cartel. So I went and hung out in the Central Valley of California in the spring of 2022, and a nice, robust harvest is on the trees, and the almond farmers are really nervous because their warehouses are loaded with the previous year's harvest. That harvest was mostly sold to buyers in places like Japan, the Middle East, but they can't get the shipping companies to pick up their shipments, mostly at the Port of Oakland, because the price of moving a shipping container from China to the West Coast of the United States has gone from like $2,500 to $20,000, sometimes $28,000. With all the fees thrown in. So they want to get their empty containers back to China as quickly as possible to get the next load of factory goods. They're not going to be bothered picking up a bunch of almonds. They're actually burning diesel fuel to send empty containers, to send air back across the Pacific. And the almond farmers are just hopelessly waiting for containers that never come to pick up their crop.
Wow. So you put focus on something here between 2009 and 2018, and right away it takes me back to the recession of 2009. What happened between that time period and the rebuilding of America that suddenly the shareholders, they were the top of the game?
Well, we had a very weak recovery in terms of how economists view it. We had corporate profits go up. We had economic growth, but we didn't have a lot of job gains. We didn't have a lot of wage gains. And what productivity increases we saw, that's, economists' fancy talk for how much value do you squeeze out of an hour of labor. The benefits mostly went to shareholders, and ordinary workers, their pay stagnated. In some cases, it went down. People lost manufacturing jobs, ended up in places like warehouses, often making, half what they previously made. This is a major reason why there's been this backlash against trade and globalization.
Wow. I would love to put this book in the hands of two presidential candidates, because there's some stuff in here that is so real, and needs to be talked about. And I love the fact that you've got the courage to put this out here so that we can get the talk started.
Oh, I really appreciate that. I mean, I think, the supply chain is not something I expect to ever write a book about. Most of us don't think about it until it fails. But boy, we better get this right, or we're going to be talking about this again.
Yeah. Is anybody getting richer over this?
Oh, yeah. I mean, shipping carriers made record profits. I mean, the meat packers made record profits. Virtually every industry I examine in my book, our distress turned into record profits for the companies that have these huge market concentrations. And we are paying, ordinary people are paying higher prices. And it's not because the people making our goods are getting fat. It's mostly because the companies that control these bottlenecks, and a lot of transportation companies, the shareholders are raking off most of the gains.
Did you film any of this? And the reason why I'm asking that is because this kind of a show is what I would love to see on the Travel Channel. Traveling the world to share with us what really takes place behind where the wizard is hanging out behind the curtain.
I did some podcasts. Yeah. I did audio. CNN just sat with me for a documentary that aired a couple of days ago on how Mexico could potentially be the solution to some of these problems by moving production closer to the U.S., as well as moving production back to the U.S. We should be making more stuff in the United States. But no, I'm not sitting on a lot of video.
What an amazing book, one of education as well as, empowering a consumer to be better at their own game. Peter, you be brilliant today. Come back to the show anytime in the future.
Hey, Ara, really appreciate your enthusiasm and your questions. Take care.